that in 2014, we have come full circle once again. I must say to you something here at this point about my own advancement. Recently, I have been doing a survey of my own family history. On my father's side, that is the Welch side of my being, the ancestor was a man called Brewster, who died when he was about 91 years old, and whom my research has identified was enslaved on a plantation owned by Harriet Leslie Brewster and later by a man called Thomas Ruck. This ancestor was married in 1837 during the apprenticeship period, and his name appears in the archival records of Barbados as being an apprentice of Thomas L. Ruck. That is how I know for sure that he was enslaved, because you're only an apprentice in the 1830s if you have been enslaved on the plantation. In 1847, he turns up on the Christchurch land register as an owner of 2 acres. I currently live on a 1/4 acre of that 2-acre lot. The other portion of the land has long since been fragmented and dispersed among family members and gone to others. But he was illiterate, deprived because of his enslaved status from access to an education. But he managed to overcome the odds to become a landowner. As I said, I benefit from that initial entrepreneurial spirit, which led him to get a piece of land. I said, I live on a 1/4 acre of that. I have since then excavated a section by way of construction, and I have discovered some of the pottery that he used, and a 19th century silver thimble, which he had acquired somewhere along the way in that family. That's on my father's side. And essentially his great-great-great-grandson, who was, of course, my grandfather, entered the teaching profession and eventually became a principal of St. Bartholomew's School, another school, St. Christopher's. That's on my father's side. On my mother's side of the family, I trace my ancestry back to an enslaved woman called Mary Delia, an enslaved worker on Ashford Plantation in St. John. And when I look at that family background, I also note that out of that background, I arrived at my grandfather, Frank Herbert Barker, son of Samuel Christopher Barker, and he also became a principal. So on both sides of my family, from an enslaved background, using whatever opportunities were available, the family arrived at a position where, on both sides, they saw education as a vehicle for social mobility and saw that education as a means of improving not only economic circumstances, but what they call the moral and intellectual circumstances of the family. And the rest, as I say, is history, because I was referring to my own advancement. So when I grew up as a young boy, I had before me all of the necessary examples, all of the necessary imperatives to choose the life that I did eventually choose. I entered a number of professions. I served in many other capacities which are not on my CV. And those capacities included a lot of hard work. And I was involved in as a lab technician, in sugarcane research, as a clerk in the private sector, in several other ways. But eventually it led to the position I now hold. I mentioned that to you because what I'm delivering to you is not only an intellectual exercise, but it's a very personal exercise for me. Because I look at the students who are coming now, and I look at my own progress, and I wish for them what happened to me. I wish for them the same progress that I've made, and that others like myself have made. As we move on very quickly, things change under Sir Grantley Adams, and then under the Right Excellent Honourable Errol Barrow. And in their periods, we witnessed the most aggressive intervention of the state in the education system today. such that out of their efforts, we witnessed the veritable creation of the modern middle class in Barbados. We must not misunderstand how the middle class came to be. The middle class in Barbados is not of late origin, it's of really relatively recent origin. The middle class in Barbados, as we know today, maybe dated back to the late 50s and the early 60s. That's where the middle class began to develop in Barbados. And one of the principal issues that led to the development of the middle class was the development of education opportunity. And that was based on the themes of social justice. And it was time for more of our financial institutions to begin to look closely at this question of finance in education. We have to move beyond seeing education simply as a matter of providing books and lunches and other things of that kind. We have to begin to see education as a project worthy of investment, a project that has the potential for economic growth and the potential for increasing profit margins. We have to move beyond the traditional way of looking at the question of private finance in education. In the local context, the proposal that students will be called upon to finance the tuition fee of their university costs. It may be known that other sectors of the tertiary education sector are not faced with the same order of reduction in budgetary allocation. On this basis, however, therefore, it was seen that a projection for the future in terms of an increasing emphasis on self-funding might well be the paradigm of that future. Having arrived at this point, then, it is useful to consider the implication of self-funding as it relates to questions of justice and equity. Our attention then turns to some historical issues as we look at these implications. The self-funding model is not a new one in the education history of Barbados, or the Caribbean for that matter. After emancipation, the British government did provide some partial funding of the education system through the so-styled, quote, Negro Education Fund, unquote. However, this grant was withdrawn in 1844 and was left to the local assemblies to finance the provision of education at the elementary and secondary levels. By and large, however, the provision of funding for education was outstripped by the funding for the police and the criminal justice system. Thus, in 1848, expenditure on public education amounted to 2.5% of the annual budget, with 34% going to the police force and 7.2% going to the prison system. Several years ago, I heard a statement which had to do with the cost of ignorance. And the statement said, if you think education is costly, think what ignorance would cost. That's where we are. In 1952, the proportion of the budget spent on education had inched from 2.5% to about 3.8%. In 1856, there was a further rise in the percentage spent on education to about 4.4%, while that spent on the police was about 21.3%. And incidentally, as an aside, let me say this, that moving out of emancipation right up to the 1940s, we faced a system which did not see for our people, and the majority of our people, any intellectual future. Our people were not expected to rise to a tertiary level of education. Back in the late 19th century, an English professor, a Regius professor, came to the Caribbean. His name was Anthony Froude. And Froude made a comment about the West Indian, or the Afro-West Indians, and he said that they were like children who needed to be led. One of the Caribbean's foremost scholars of the time, an Afro-Trinidadian called J.J. Thomas, wrote a book called Fraudacity, in which he challenged Froude to understand that the reason for the state of education of the masses had nothing to do with the masses' desire to advance, but had to do with the fact that those who were charged with the responsibility of educating them had not lived up to that responsibility. When we speak of educational opportunity, we do well to follow the submissions of Professor Les Brown, whose book Justice, Morality, and Education, he suggests, is a must-read for anyone who wishes to debate the issues of education and its relation to issues of social justice. In following Brown, we might view the question of education opportunity in two distinctive facets. In the first case, one may identify a formal notion of education as, quote, a developing of individual potentialities consistent with social values. Individual well-being is an integral part of this process of development. In this case, an individual will manifest growing satisfaction as his or her potentialities are progressively developed. Secondly, education opportunity may be seen in terms of an opportunity for something larger than the first, including it, but seeing it as means of widening life's prospects. In short, there is an individual and there is a social group aspect to education opportunity. Brown recommends that we join the two of these aspects of education opportunity, and he notes that in this context, the connection brings forcibly to our notice the fundamental situation of the underprivileged or those disadvantaged socially. This group, it is argued, manifests a condition that is apt to represent one of reproduction from one generation to the next. Indeed, following Brown, it is this group in particular, that is the underprivileged, that is often, quote, caught up in a web of distributive justice. Their housing, their work prospects, their struggle to survive materially, and their subsequent disposition may leave them with little chance of extricating themselves from a social condition which limits their opportunity in developing their potentialities. In this context, let me just get this back again. Yes. In this context, we may also note, as does Peter Figueroa in his book Education and the Social Construction of Race, and I have short extract on the board. I use the word board. You'll understand that that dates me somewhat, because I'm certain I was from a different age and generation. At the time when I came along, this that we see here was not in our thinking. I came along in the area when we in fact, some of you will not be familiar with the use of the slate and the slate pencil, but I came along at that time. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Oh, right. All right. Some of you, yes. But I came along at that time, and certainly, as I was speaking at the table early this morning, when I observe our young children, I'm convinced that the next generation will have an extra thumb, because when I watch them and I see them observing them with their cell phones and what they're doing, I'm still at the stage where my cell phone, I'm still doing this. My daughter's doing this. And that's the kind of thing that's happening. But nevertheless, following Figueroa, he says, and this quotation I put in here as I think particularly important for our consideration: those who are less equal are also less free. They have fewer options and fewer resources. The purpose of this aspect of my presentation is simple. If self-funded education is in fact the paradigm of the future, where does this leave the more vulnerable, the socially and economically disadvantaged? This leads us to a consideration of the themes of justice and equity. Again, like Brown, we must confess that we cannot escape a fundamental impression that the idea of justice is fairness. However, we might also bear in mind that fairness is a composite notion, which includes fairness as consistency in the application of rules and standards, as well as fairness as equity in its adjectival sense of equitable. It is this adjectival sense that lends to fairness a dimension of evenness or balance between or among people. In that regard, then, we do well to note that equity as fairness, or as a fair balance or proportion among people in a relevant situation, such as one involving a distribution of goods and services, ought to be an underlying consideration in any matter of education support. Thus, for education to have a suitable base on which general improvement in the fortunes of a disadvantaged population can be generated, there must be social conditions that offer hope for the future. When those conditions prevail, the individual will then have an opportunity to improve his or her condition still further by means of access to education. To put it more succinctly, again, following Les Brown, the primary principle of equality of educational opportunity is this, that each person has an equal right to education according to need, regardless of whether he or she is fortunate or unfortunate in national endowments or in the social conditions of his or her upbringing. The fact is that the financial is only part of a matrix of other things. There can be little doubt that across the world there has been some retreat from spending on education in terms of a decline in the percentage of the national budget across the world. Take, for example, the case of the European Union, Europe in general. Of 15 European countries surveyed, 9 of them showed a decline in spending on education over the period between 2008 and 2012. That ranged from a high or low, depending on how one looked at it, of 25% in the case of Greece to 1.5% in the case of Portugal. And again, for those of us who have been listening to the world news and who have been observing the financial situation across the world, the fact that there's a 25% decline in spending on education in Greece should not surprise us. And we might, in fact, see in that decline something of our own predicament within the Caribbean, since so many of our economies bear very close similarity to this situation in Greece. In the case of Barbados, spending on education ran at an average of about 17.5% over the period between 2005 and 2010. That's 17.5% of GNP or GDP, depending on what measurement you use. However, with the problems facing the global economy, and indeed by extension the local economy, attention has been placed on reducing the expenditure on tertiary education. Of course, other sectors of the economy too also face the threat of reduction in the percentage of budgetary allocation by the government. And again, as we point out, this is not unique to the Barbados government. Throughout the Caribbean, even in oil-rich Trinidad, we do have some signs that governments are rethinking the question of the quantum allocated to tertiary education and to education in general. In commenting on the global trends in cost sharing, Ryan Han wrote, and this is an early article, but I think it is valuable for our purpose, wrote in a 2008 article, and I have it on the screen if you can follow with me. And I quote, "In recent years, cost sharing has been on the rise. Tuition has been introduced in countries such as Australia, China, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Likewise, where charging tuition was already the norm, example, Canada, Japan, and the United States, students have faced a substantial rise in tuition. While the growth of cost sharing has been swift, and that issue of cost sharing has to do with the shift in government from funding the academy totally, rather to sharing the cost of funding, the financial mechanisms to facilitate this cost sharing have not developed as quickly.